When I was 11, I moved to a rather big city due to my dad getting transferred at his work. Before that, I lived in a relatively small town known for practically nothing. I loved that town with all my heart, and I still love it even today, but this experience shattered my little kid illusion that it was safe and nothing bad could ever happen to anyone. I lived in a very close-knit neighborhood where all the parents knew each other and all of the kids were friends. At the end of my street was a small, half-built house that became sort of the neighborhood hangout for everyone. It had been abandoned during its construction for unknown reasons, and it sat there for nearly 2 years before we all decided it was the perfect clubhouse. All of the kids would walk home from school together, stop in to tell their parents where they were going, and then head down to the house. One Saturday, I went across the street to my friend's house and asked if she wanted to go to the clubhouse with me. She said she was eating lunch, but that she'd meet me there as soon as she was done. I was only 7 at the time, but my parents trusted me enough not to get into any trouble or run off somewhere, so I headed down to the house to wait. I was sitting on the front steps of the house when a white car with very darkly tinted windows pulled up to the curb. To my young mind, it looked exactly like a police car, just without the lights on top of it, so I thought they were undercover or something. I was 7, cut me some slack. The driver of the car rolled down the passenger window and leaned over the seat, and I could see he was wearing a police officer's uniform and aviator sunglasses. He waved me over, and not wanting to make the cop angry, I approached the passenger side of the car. "Hey there, do you think you could help me with something?" he asked me. He seemed nice enough, so I told him that I'd try. He went on to show me a picture of a little girl I'd never seen before and asked if I knew her. I shook my head, and he told me that she was missing and that her parents really wanted her back, but he was having trouble finding her. At that point, my friend from earlier, Anna, had showed up. The guy asked Anna if she had seen the little girl, but she hadn't seen her either. He then seemed to get really sad and shook his head and said, "I just really wish I could find her. Do you two want to help me look? If you can get in my car, we can drive around and see if we can find her." To me, that sounded awesome, and I threw all notions of stranger danger out the window. I'd never been in a police car before and thought I'd have the time of my life, but Anna seemed to have her head on right that day and politely declined. This visibly upset the guy, and he got really angry, telling us he'd arrest us if we didn't get in the car and help him. Anna and I both started freaking out, and we booked it to my house when the guy reached into his glove box and pulled out a set of handcuffs. He sped off as soon as we started running. At that point, we were both crying, but we managed to get to my house and tell my mom what had happened. She immediately called the police and asked if they had an officer patrolling in our neighborhood, but of course they didn't. So the real cops showed up to my house and asked me and Anna a ton of questions, and I realized that the scary guy's police uniform was way off. They tried to get a description from us, but he was wearing a hat and sunglasses that blocked most of his face, so it didn't really amount to much. We were, however, able to provide a description of the little girl in the picture. As far as I know, nothing happened with the guy. I've tried searching for any news articles, but I haven't found anything. The description we gave of the little girl didn't match any missing people within a 100-mile radius of our town, so nothing really came of that either. After that, none of the kids in my neighborhood were allowed to go to the clubhouse or be outside without at least one parent supervising us. This happened to me about 2 years ago when I was on a cross-country road trip with my good friend Kim. We started in the Northwest and our final destination was in Georgia. We were trying to make this trip as quickly as possible, and since it was just the two of us, we took turns driving and sleeping. We had just passed through Laramie, Wyoming, where I got pulled over for speeding. It wasn't by much, only 10 miles over the speed limit. I apologized to the police officer and he kindly let us off the hook since our car had no cruise control and we had a long way to go ahead. After leaving Laramie, we didn't stop for a long time and the highway rarely cut through any towns. It was probably 3, maybe 4 in the morning and the highway was deserted. Tall pine trees lined the 2-lane blacktop and jagged mountains covered our surroundings. Kim was sleeping heavily, her chair reclined all the way down, a blanket thrown over her head. I had the radio on, but she was exhausted, so she didn't even move or notice. I was trying to concentrate on the road and the quiet music on the radio to stay awake. Visibility was very limited, as there were no lights on this road. Suddenly, red and blue lights flashed in my rearview mirror. I hastily looked at my speedometer, but I was diligently following the speed limit after the narrow escape from the ticket earlier. I pulled over, killed my engine, and rolled down my window. The cop car behind me appeared to be an unmarked vehicle, but it was hard to tell because it was so dark. Kim didn't even move as the police officer approached my window. "Ma'am," he said, "do you know why I pulled you over today?" No, officer, I don't." His flashlight was pointed directly at my face and I had to avert my eyes. "Your plates sure are from far away. Where are you headed?" The police officer in Laramie had asked me the same thing. "Georgia. Family emergency." "Is that so? Well, you weren't in any shape to make it to Georgia from Nebraska. No siree." I frowned. Was my car breaking down? Were my taillights out? In my tired haze, had I missed something vital? I'm sorry, what's wrong? Here, step out of the car, I'll show you." He gestured with his flashlight and the beam slanted across Kim's blanket-shrouded face and she sat up. She yawned. "What's going on?" The police officer abruptly turned, walked away, and got into his car. He flipped a U-turn and sped off in the opposite direction down the highway. Kim and I stared at each other for a moment before I started the car, rolled up the window, and sped off with no regard for the speed limit this time. A while back, when I lived in a small town with long, winding stretches of road between my house and my workplace, I had a rather unsettling run-in with a police officer. I worked the night shift, so it was about 11 p.m. It was Saturday and I had just set out towards the hotel I worked at. I have a GPS system that logs a high amount of information, so I know that I wasn't speeding. After driving for about a mile, I noticed a car starts following me very closely. After a couple of miles of this, I've decided I've had enough, so I switch lanes in front of a few other cars and keep driving. Predictably, this person, it was too dark to see anything but their headlights as there were few street lights in this remote area, weaves in and out of cars to get right back behind me. Finally, after being tailgated for about 13 miles, I get to a lone stretch of road and the speed limit increases to 55 miles per hour. I gladly take the opportunity to go faster once I pass the sign, and admittedly, I did get up to 57 miles per hour as this person continued to tailgate me. And he turns his lights on. I'm already nervous as the road is dark and it's late, but there are just enough cars going by for me to reason with myself to pull over. And then the cop turns his lights off, which I'm quite certain they're not supposed to do. He approaches my window and chides me for speeding, saying he saw me going 70 in a 30-mile-per-hour zone on the street he initially started following me on. I tell him my GPS log can say otherwise, and I bluffed a bit. Stupid, I know, saying that I had a device from my insurance company that also tracks my driving. He claims he saw me weaving all over the road and assumed I was drunk, and I questioned why, if I was speeding so seriously and driving so poorly, he followed me for 13 miles, passing said obvious drunk drivers and people speeding past us to do so, instead of pulling me over immediately. Completely ignoring my question, the cop glances down and says my car is going to cause the grass I'm parked on to catch fire. Now, you're probably thinking what I'm thinking. What the fuck? That makes no sense. And then he asked me to pull into an empty lot on top of a nearby hill, a lot that was completely impossible to see from the road. Nervous, I act as if I'm going to, and accidentally, not really, pass it only to pull into a residential parking lot with all the lights on. The cop gets out, obviously angry, and demands to see my license and registration. I turned it in and he gets in his car for just a few minutes, during which I quite obviously get my phone out and tell my coworkers what's going on. He then gets out of the car, returns my information claiming he let me off with a warning, and drives off quickly. He returned my registration but kept my license, and the slip had a bunch of scribbles on it in place of any real words. The next day I called the station looking for my license, and of course, he hadn't turned it in. I told them what had happened and gave them some information that they asked for, including some numbers on the ticket that I could read, and they said they'd look into it. The next few days, I did see a cop car on the roads near my house, but I wrote it off as noticing something normal out of paranoia. My father thought I was being ridiculous, which upset me quite a bit as I still had, and have, that fake ticket. Luckily, I'd been planning a move and moved out of state just a week or so later, but I hope that my complaint was looked into and that man didn't do anything wrong to anyone else. I don't know if he was a real cop or a fake cop, but nonetheless, the experience was definitely scary.